The landlord thought he was humiliating just another desperate tenant in court, a crying black mother who had fallen behind on rent and had no power left to fight back. But what he didn't know was that the woman he mocked had once spent years sitting only a few feet away from the judge, working behind that very bench and learning every rule of the courtroom he thought he controlled. The morning had begun like any other eviction hearing at the county courthouse, a quiet room filled with wooden benches, nervous tenants clutching paperwork, and landlords confident the law would side with them. But when Angela Brooks stepped through the doors holding her daughter's small backpack in one hand and a folder of documents in the other, it was clear this wasn't just another routine case, because Angela looked exhausted in a way that only comes from months of stress and sleepless nights. Her eyes red from crying, but still carrying a quiet dignity as she took her seat at the defendant's table, while across the aisle her landlord Richard Coleman leaned back in his chair with the kind of smug confidence that comes from believing money and power will always win, his expensive watch catching the light as he whispered jokes to the attorney beside him, occasionally glancing over at Angela as if she were little more than an inconvenience delaying his day. And for Angela, the humiliation was already beginning before the hearing had even started, because several people in the room recognized the situation all too well. A single mother, recently behind on rent, standing alone against a property owner with lawyers and paperwork ready to push her out. Yet what none of them realized was that Angela had once sat on the other side of that room entirely, not as a defendant, but as someone who had helped run the very system now judging her. Because for 8 years Angela Brooks had worked as a courtroom clerk in that same courthouse, arriving early every morning to prepare case files, assist judges, guide attorneys through procedures, and help frightened families understand the complicated language of the law. But life had a way of shifting even the strongest routines, and 2 years earlier everything had begun to unravel when Angela's mother fell seriously ill and needed constant care, forcing Angela to leave the courthouse job she loved so she could work flexible shifts at a nearby hospital while raising her young daughter Maya on her own, a change that it seemed manageable at first but slowly became overwhelming as medical bills grew, work hours fluctuated, and the cost of living climbed higher than she could keep up with, especially when her landlord Richard Coleman purchased the building she lived in and quickly began raising rents across the property, claiming renovations and market adjustments, even though most of the changes were cosmetic at best. And while other tenants quietly moved out when the rent increased, Angela stayed because it was the only place close enough to her daughter's school and her hospital job, promising herself she would find a better solution soon. But when the hospital reduced her hours after budget cuts, the careful balance she had maintained for years finally collapsed, leaving her 2 months behind on rent and facing the eviction notice that now sat in the judge's file, a situation Angela had hoped to explain calmly in court, believing that if she could just ask for a little more time she could recover and catch up. But the moment the case was called and both sides stepped forward, Richard Coleman made it clear he had no interest in patience or understanding, because as soon as the judge began reviewing the paperwork, Coleman let out a dramatic sigh and spoke loudly enough for half the courtroom to hear, saying this was exactly why landlords had to be strict, that if you gave people too many chances they would take advantage of you. And though he never used a direct insult at first, the way he looked at Angela and the tone of his voice carried a message everyone in the room could feel, one that suggested he saw her not as a struggling tenant, but as a stereotype he had already decided was true. And when Angela tried to explain that she had worked for years to stay responsible, that she had never missed a payment until the last few months, Coleman interrupted her with a laugh that echoed against the courtroom walls, shaking his head and muttering that every tenant had a story when it came time to pay rent, while Angela felt the eyes of strangers turning toward her, some sympathetic, others simply curious, and the pressure of that attention made her voice tremble as she continued describing the hospital schedule changes and her daughter's needs. But Coleman leaned forward again, clearly enjoying the moment, telling the judge that he had heard enough excuses and that people who couldn't afford to live somewhere should simply move somewhere cheaper, adding with a dismissive shrug that the building had a reputation to maintain and he couldn't let one tenant drag down the property standards, a statement that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats because the implication was obvious even if the words were carefully chosen. And Angela felt the humiliation rising in her chest like a wave she couldn't stop. tears forming despite her best effort to stay composed, because she knew exactly how this courtroom usually worked. She had seen hundreds of cases just like this from the clerk's desk behind the bench, watching judges balance the law against human hardship while landlords pushed for quick removals and tenants begged for time. And she had always believed that if she ever stood in that position herself, she would know how to remain calm and explain the facts clearly. Yet sitting there now with her landlord mocking her and the weight of the past year pressing down on her shoulders, the words she had practiced all morning suddenly felt fragile and small, while Richard Coleman leaned back with a satisfied smirk as if the outcome were already decided, unaware that the woman he was ridiculing had once spent countless hours helping judges interpret the very rules he thought he could manipulate, unaware that the courtroom he treated like his personal stage was a place Angela understood far better than he imagined, and unaware that before the day was over someone was going to walk through those courtroom doors who remembered exactly who Angela Brooks was, and why mocking her might be the biggest mistake he had ever made. The landlord believed the case was already won, that the crying black mother sitting across from him had no chance of stopping the eviction he had filed, and for a moment the courtroom seemed to support that belief as the judge quietly reviewed the paperwork while Angela Brooks wiped her eyes and tried to steady her breathing, the weight of the past year pressing down on her as she sat alone at the defendant's table with nothing but a folder of documents and the hope that someone might give her a little time. Yet even in that difficult moment, Angela noticed small details most people would overlook. The way the clerk organized the files on the bench, the quiet signals exchanged between the bailiff and the judge, the rhythm of the courtroom that she had once known so well when she worked there years earlier. And remembering that life made the situation feel even more painful, because this courthouse had once been a place where she felt respected and useful, a place where she helped people understand the law rather than fear it. But now she was the one being judged while her landlord Richard Coleman leaned comfortably in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who assumed money and status guaranteed victory, occasionally whispering to his lawyer and making comments loud enough for nearby people to hear, claiming he had already been far too patient with tenants who couldn't manage their responsibilities, a remark that clearly pointed at Angela even though he never said her name. And when she tried again to explain that she had lost hours at the hospital where she worked and only needed a short extension to catch up on rent, Coleman interrupted with a dismissive laugh and said the building wasn't a charity, adding that if he allowed every struggling tenant to stay, the property would fall apart, his voice carrying that same subtle tone of prejudice that had been present since the hearing began, the kind that suggested he had already decided exactly what kind of person Angela was before she ever spoke. And several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably as he continued, muttering that people who couldn't afford certain places should simply live somewhere more appropriate. Words carefully chosen but still heavy with meaning, while Angela lowered her eyes, fighting the embarrassment of being talked about like she wasn't even sitting there, remembering how many times she had seen similar moments unfold when she worked as a courtroom clerk behind the judge's bench, watching tenants struggle to defend themselves while landlords pushed for quick evictions. And she had always believed that if she ever found herself in that position, she would know exactly what to say and how to stay calm. Yet sitting there now with tears threatening to return and her landlord mocking her situation, the words she had practiced all morning suddenly felt fragile and small, until something unexpected happened that changed the atmosphere of the room completely, because the courtroom doors opened with a quiet creak and a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside, immediately drawing attention from the bailiff and several attorneys who quickly stood as they recognized him. Judge Marcus Bennett, one of the most respected judges in the county, known for his strict understanding of the law and his belief that every person deserved dignity in his courtroom. Yet he wasn't scheduled to be there that morning, which made his appearance surprising, enough to send whispers across the benches. While Richard Coleman frowned slightly, as if annoyed by the interruption, unaware that the moment would soon shift the entire tone of the hearing, because Judge Bennett wasn't looking at the landlord at all. His attention had already settled on Angela Brooks as he studied her face carefully, recognition slowly appearing in his expression before he stepped a little closer and spoke a question that caused the entire courtroom to fall silent. "Ms. Brooks, is that you?" And the sound of her name spoken with respect made Angela look up in confusion before she nodded softly, answering yes, unsure why the judge remembered her after so many years. But Judge Bennett clearly did, because he turned toward the bench and calmly explained that before the hearing continued, he wanted something clarified for the record, something everyone in the room, especially the landlord, should understand. And as the courtroom grew completely quiet, he stated that Angela Brooks had once served in that same courthouse for 8 years as one of the most dependable courtroom clerks they had. Someone who stayed late when cases ran long and helped families navigate confusing legal procedures. A woman who had spent years sitting just a few feet behind the very bench now deciding her future. And the quiet murmurs that followed made Richard Coleman shift slightly in his chair as the confidence he had shown earlier began to fade. Because the woman he had been mocking only minutes before clearly knew the courtroom far better than he had ever realized. Richard Coleman's confidence began to slip the moment the courtroom realized who Angela Brooks really was. But Judge Marcus Bennett wasn't finished yet, because after acknowledging Angela's years of service in the courthouse, he calmly asked the clerk to bring forward the full housing records connected to the eviction filing, explaining that the court should always review the complete timeline before making a final decision. And as the documents were placed on the bench, the room grew quiet while he flipped through page after page, his expression becoming more serious with each line he read, until finally he looked up and asked the landlord a simple question that immediately changed the tone of the hearing. Why had Angela's rent increased so dramatically within a single year, a jump far higher than the typical annual adjustments allowed in the county? And Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his seat before replying that it was a market adjustment, trying to sound confident even as several people in the courtroom leaned forward to hear the answer. But the judge continued reviewing the paperwork and calmly explained that increases above a certain percentage required formal notice and legal justification, something that did not appear anywhere in the documents submitted by Coleman's company, which caused a ripple of murmurs to move through the benches as the situation suddenly looked very different from the simple eviction story the landlord had presented earlier. And when Judge Bennett finally set the papers down, he addressed the room in a firm but measured voice, stating that based on the records in front of him, Angela Brooks had maintained a consistent payment history for years before the sudden rent increase, and that the eviction request would be dismissed pending investigation into whether the rent changes violated housing regulations. Words that made Angela close her eyes briefly in relief while the gallery reacted with quiet gasps. But the judge didn't stop there, because he turned toward Richard Coleman with a steady look and reminded him that conduct inside a courtroom mattered just as much as the paperwork filed within it, noting that comments made earlier during the hearing suggested a level of disrespect that had no place in a legal proceeding, especially when directed towards someone who had once worked to uphold the integrity of that very courthouse. And though he didn't raise his voice, the message was clear enough to drain the color from Coleman's face as he realized the situation had completely reversed, because the woman he believed was powerless had just been defended by the system he thought would automatically side with him. And as the hearing ended, Angela gathered her papers slowly, still processing what had happened, while several courthouse staff members quietly greeted her with warm smiles of recognition, reminding her that she was not forgotten in the place where she had once worked so hard. While Richard Coleman left the courtroom in silence, no longer the confident landlord who had walked in expecting an easy victory, but a man suddenly facing questions about his own actions. And as Angela stepped out into the hallway with her daughter waiting nearby, she took a deep breath of relief, realizing that sometimes the people others try hardest to humiliate are the very ones who understand the truth best. And in this case, the landlord who mocked a crying mother had just learned the hard way that she knew that courtroom far better than he ever did.